There is a quiet, almost imperceptible moment in adulthood when the unspoken expectation of rescue finally dies. It rarely arrives with a dramatic crisis, but rather with the cold clarity that your choices, debts, and silences belong entirely to you. Yet in that sudden isolation, a radical transformation occurs. The precise moment you stop waiting for help is when you inherit a strange, unshakable power. Most people spend the early decades of adulthood harboring an unexamined psychological buffer, the quiet, instinctual assumption that an invisible authority will eventually step in to balance their accounts. You see this dynamic not in grand, tragic moments, but in subtle, ordinary scenes, stepping out of a room after receiving polite applause for an achievement, only to realize that external approval left the central weight of your life completely untouched. Or interrupting yourself mid-sentence during a tense disagreement, struck by the sudden realization that even if you persuade the other person, your fundamental internal doubt remains entirely unaddressed. We carry an unconscious reliance on time, authority, or eventual good fortune to straighten out what feels crooked, waiting for an adult to enter the room, assess the damage, and assume final responsibility. This posture creates a subtle, ongoing holding pattern. Without consciously admitting it, we structure our daily lives around deferred risk. We hesitate to finalize difficult decisions, remain tethered to stagnant commitments, or put off necessary personal transformations under the polite guise of waiting for ideal conditions to align. In truth, this hesitation is rarely about timing. It is an unconscious strategy to avoid full exposure. We seek mentors to map out our routes, partners to absorb our unresolved anxiety, or favorable shifts in circumstance to redeem our unmade choices. This quiet expectation acts as an emotional insulator. As long as rescue remains a theoretical possibility, our failures are never entirely ours, and our true capability remains conveniently untested. Yet this quiet reliance conceals a profound psychological trap. The perpetual hope of external intervention, while comforting, actively preserves personal fragility and holds development in a state of suspended animation. By delegating the ultimate outcome of your existence to outside forces, you surrender the very mechanism that builds genuine sovereignty. When this illusion shatters, when a critical turning point arrives and the surrounding room remains completely silent, a disorienting dislocation occurs. The immediate reaction is often a mixture of quiet grief and resentment. Reality suddenly reveals itself to be indifferent, unconcerned with your private sacrifices or unvoiced expectations. However, within this uncomfortable solitude lies a startling psychological contradiction. What initially feels like abandonment is actually the removal of an invisible, self-imposed cage. The individual who comes to terms with total self-reliance ceases to operate on the terms of social validation, consensus timing, or institutional safety. They no longer waste mental bandwidth, negotiating with difficult circumstances or waiting for permission to begin. While others remain stalled, waiting for conditions to stabilize or seeking approval before moving forward, the person who accepts complete responsibility moves with an unburdened, decisive momentum that surrounding observers find impossible to predict or match. This shift from passive expectation to absolute agency represents one of the least understood dynamics in the psychology of human action. It forces us to confront an unsettling question. If the collapse of external hope feels initially like a loss, why does it so consistently mark the birth of an extraordinary, almost unfair advantage? To understand why this shift creates such a formidable edge, we must examine a fundamental paradox in human behavior. We naturally assume that relying on a rescue structure, whether an institutional safety net, a supportive mentor, or an eventual financial windfall, provides a foundation of strength. It feels prudent to operate with an alternative exit. Yet in practice, the presence of a fallback plan subtly degrades the razor sharpness of our choices. When retreat remains accessible, full commitment becomes negotiable. The mental energy that could be channeled into irreversible execution is instead divided between advancing and constantly monitoring the safety of the escape route. This division of consciousness creates a quiet, insidious inertia. We tell ourselves we are waiting because conditions are volatile, because resources are insufficient, or because we need further validation from an established authority. But beneath these reasonable excuses lies a deeper, unexamined transaction. We are trading immediate agency for emotional security. In-depth psychology, specifically in the conceptual framework articulated by thinkers like Jung, this state corresponds to the outward projection of one's own undeveloped authority. When an individual imagines that an external force will eventually resolve their deadlock, they are projecting their own latent sovereignty onto the world. The savior is not a person or an event, it is a misplaced portion of their own psyche. Consequently, the lingering expectation of rescue does not protect us from suffering, it merely transforms acute, transformative trials into a slow, enduring state of stagnation. The person waiting for permission never experiences a decisive, revealing defeat, but they also never fully possess their own life. They exist in a buffer zone of unproven potential, permanently unfulfilled. The unfair advantage emerges precisely when this projected fantasy collapses back into the self. When you realize with absolute certainty that no external entity will ever come to manage your trajectory, your relationship with reality transforms instantly. The luxury of hesitation evaporates. The habit of searching a room for an authority figure becomes obsolete. But this realization brings forward a far more disturbing question. If the illusion of rescue is so paralyzing to human potential, why do our minds fight so fiercely to protect it? What hidden benefit are we secretly receiving by keeping ourselves dependent on a force outside our own control? The answer lies in the subtle emotional immunity that dependency affords. As long as you are waiting to be saved, you hold a psychological exemption. If your current position is unsatisfactory but an external resolution, whether a future mentor, a systemic reform, or a fortunate alignment of events, is required to fix it, then your present stagnation is not a personal failure. The hope of rescue operates as an invisible shield against the weight of absolute responsibility. It allows an individual to maintain a noble narrative about their unfulfilled potential while quietly avoiding the demand of self-determination. This hidden mechanism reveals why so many people remain trapped in stagnant conditions for years. The conscious mind laments the lack of support, but the unconscious mind secretly relies on it. Dependency buys safety at the expense of sovereignty. To admit that no one is coming is to accept that your compromises, your silence, and your current boundaries are direct reflections of your own choices. It means recognizing that the environment you complain about is an environment you continue to permit. When this structural realization takes root, it forces a profound internal reckoning. The mind must dismantle the comfortable identity of the unappreciated victim. In Jungian terms, this requires confronting the shadow, the disowned, unexamined aspects of the self that prefer passive suffering over the vulnerability of active risk. We realize that our waiting was never an enforced sentence. It was an unconscious strategy to avoid full exposure. It is far less demanding to lament a lack of support than to step into the open and test your own capacity. As long as you believe someone else holds the key to your trajectory, you never have to face the possibility of your own inadequacy. Yet, once this defensive shield is dismantled, the nature of responsibility undergoes a radical shift. Responsibility ceases to be experienced as a heavy burden imposed by duty. Instead, it reveals itself as the primary instrument of personal power. The individual recognizes that if no external entity is responsible for their salvation, then no external entity possesses the authority to constrain their movement. The indifferent silence of the world transforms from a threat into an open space upon which genuine autonomy can be built. But how does this internal shift translate into a tangible strategic advantage? What specific cognitive alignment occurs when the mind operates completely free from the drag of external expectation? To understand the strategic advantage that emerges from this realization, one must examine how human perception itself is structured. Our minds do not process reality objectively. They filter information through our underlying expectations. When a person operates under the tacit belief that help is forthcoming, their perception prioritizes signals of support, validation, and safety. They scan their environment for permission structures, waiting for an approving nod from an authority before taking decisive action. This creates an invisible friction, a perceptual lag between the moment an opportunity appears and the moment an attempt is made. The individual is constantly negotiating with their environment, asking whether it is safe to proceed. When the expectation of rescue is permanently eliminated, this perceptual filter undergoes an immediate, radical recalibration. Reality is no longer viewed through the emotional lens of what should happen, but through the uncompromising lens of what simply is. The mind stops searching for validation and begins searching exclusively for leverage. Every circumstance, whether favorable or hostile, is stripped of its dramatic weight and reduced to a set of raw, workable variables. This shift radically increases operational speed. While others are stalled, waiting for conditions to stabilize or seeking consensus before taking a risk, the fully self-reliant individual is already adapting, testing, and executing. They do not lose critical time mourning the absence of a safety net because they no longer account for one in their fundamental calculations. This reframes the core conflict of human action entirely. The primary barrier to extraordinary accomplishment is rarely a lack of talent, resources, or sheer intellect. Rather, it is the subtle, ongoing leakage of cognitive energy spent managing the expectation of external support. The unfair advantage is not an inherent superiority of skill or luck, it is the total, merciless elimination of internal hesitation. It is the profound clarity that comes when the exhausting internal dialogue between what I want and who will come to help me get it is permanently collapsed into a single direct imperative. What must I build with what I have right now? Yet this cognitive alignment is not merely an intellectual strategy that one can adopt on command through sheer willpower. It demands a fundamental rewriting of how an individual processes their everyday existence, their micro-decisions, and their quietest daily failures. How does this abstract psychological shift actually manifest in the gritty, unglamorous texture of a human life, where old habits, lingering self-doubt, and instinctual longings for comfort constantly attempt to reclaim control over the mind? In daily life, the transition away from waiting manifests not in grand, heroic gestures, but in subtle behavioral recalculations. You observe it during a critical professional impasse when an unexpected obstacle threatens a plan. The person who still harbors a belief in rescue instinctively scans the room for an authority figure to intervene, or pauses to craft a narrative that shifts accountability onto external delays. Conversely, the individual who has abandoned external expectation reacts with a quiet, almost cold neutrality. They do not look for someone to share the blame or validate their frustration. They look immediately at the remaining variables they can directly control, quietly adjusting their strategy without requiring an audience. This behavioral shift fundamentally alters how one handles silence, difficulty, and social friction. When you realize that no external entity is coming to validate your path, the desire to explain yourself to skeptics vanishes. You stop arguing with people who misunderstand your ambitions because you no longer require their alignment to proceed. In your personal relationships, this resolves a persistent source of friction. You cease expecting partners, friends, or institutions to carry the emotional burden of your unfulfilled potential. You collaborate and connect from a position of personal completeness rather than needy expectation. The constant demand for immediate external reassurance gives way to an internal discipline where effort is completely detached from public praise. Most importantly, this realization changes your relationship with discomfort itself. When you accept total responsibility, pain and failure cease to feel like personal insults or evidence that you are being targeted by an uncaring world. Instead, they are recognized as the exact, non-negotiable cost of admission for building authentic agency. Every unexpected setback becomes a precise diagnostic tool, exposing where your preparation was inadequate or where your initial assumptions were naive. The urge to retreat into passive endurance gives way to an active, disciplined curiosity about how to adapt. In this way, the abstract philosophical recognition of ultimate self-reliance integrates directly into the human nervous system. It ceases to be a distant theory and becomes the lived experience of personal sovereignty. You begin to notice that the very moments you previously feared, the moments when you are completely on your own, stripped of support and facing a critical choice, are precisely the moments when you feel most alive, clear, and formidable. But as this quiet shift settles into your daily identity, it confronts you with a final, deeply personal revelation about the true nature of your past waiting. Look back at the moments in your life when you felt most abandoned. Not the public catastrophes, but the unrecorded thresholds. Standing before a mirror during a quiet morning, catching your own reflection, and suddenly looking away because facing your own eyes meant acknowledging a decade of deferred choices. Or those silent moments late at night when the room grows entirely still, and in that absolute absence of noise, you realize that no revelation or external intervention is coming to resolve the quiet panic in your chest. The profound grief of those moments was rarely caused by the actual severity of your circumstances. It was caused by the slow, agonizing death of an ancient childhood fantasy, the comforting belief that the universe was holding a place for you, or that an unseen ledger was keeping a precise score of your unvoiced sacrifices. In that quiet space, a deeply personal convergence occurs. You begin to recognize that every time you pointed to your background, your lack of resources, or the individuals who failed to show up for you, you were secretly protecting yourself from the terrifying weight of your own agency. You were choosing the familiar, comfortable misery of remaining an unfulfilled spectator over the demanding work of becoming your own primary authority. The deepest pain you felt was never the pain of being abandoned by the world. It was the subtle, ongoing tragedy of abandoning yourself. When you finally surrender the expectation of external redemption, a quiet, unshakable dignity returns to your life. The chronic fatigue of deferred hope begins to lift, replaced by a steady, sober clarity. You understand that the person you were waiting for was never going to arrive from the outside, because they were meant to be constructed from within. The resolve you sought in mentors, partners, or favorable shifts in luck was sitting dormant in your own unmade decisions, patiently waiting for you to stop running. This is the precise threshold where real life begins, not with a dramatic public triumph, but with a silent, irreversible commitment to own every outcome, every debt, and every step forward on a path that is entirely your own, regardless of who remains behind. Ultimately, the realization that no one is coming to save you is not a tragic sentence of isolation. It is the ultimate threshold of liberation. What we so often mistake for an unfair or hostile world is simply a neutral, indifferent arena, unconcerned with our hidden struggles, yet instantly responsive to our direct and unyielding movement. The unfair advantage was never about possessing rare talent, superior intellect, or standing triumphantly above others. It was always about the quiet, formidable authority that emerges when you permanently cease bargaining with reality and begin working directly with what is. In the end, the collapse of external rescue does not leave you diminished or abandoned. It strips away the lingering illusions that kept your potential in a state of perpetual postponement, placing the full weight of existence back where it belongs. You are left standing in the quiet center of your own life, facing an enduring, unsettling question that continues long after the silence returns. Now that you know the door was never locked, how much longer will you remain inside?